Well, for more on this, I spoke to Jonathan Portes. He's a senior research fellow at the British National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I began by asking him what the economic benefits are for the UK if they vote to stay in the EU.
Well, of course, the most important single benefit is the single market, which is not just a free trade area, but an area where goods and to some extent services and capital can flow freely without any regulatory barriers. Now that has contributed quite significantly to the UK's growth, its trade growth over the past 30 years. Trade with the other countries in the EU is very high. We export a lot to them and they export even more to us. So that's one key advantage. Wider than that, there's of course free movement of workers. Now that's a very controversial issue here in the UK, but most economists think that free movement, labour mobility within the European Union has actually been rather good for Britain. We've benefited from a supply of relatively skilled, motivated workers who want to come here and contribute to our economy. So those, I think, are among the key benefits as well. Investment, partly because we're in the single market, the UK has actually done very well out of investment from outside the EU. Japan, China, the US, people want to invest here because they have access to the single market. There are, of course, disadvantages. So, for example, the UK is a substantial net financial contributor to the European Union. We pay in significantly more than we get out. And that's because a large part of the European Union's budget goes on the common agricultural policy. And we get considerably less out of it than some other member states like France and Italy. And moreover, the common agricultural policy doesn't just take our money, it's actually quite bad for consumers in the UK. It puts up prices higher than they would otherwise be. So that's one downside. And then there's a more contested area, which is that of over-regulation or red tape. Some people in the UK think that the European Union does too much. It's too bureaucratic. It tries to interfere too much in how businesses work, in things like working hours, for example, the 48-hour working week, in health and safety regulations, and so on.
Now, in terms of businesses, it's not just the business relationship between the UK and the EU that people are watching for. You also have the UK's trading partners. You have President Obama here in Washington saying that he would prefer if the UK stayed in the EU, and also President Xi Jinping, who also has expressed a preference for the UK staying in the EU. So how is the world viewing this situation?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that most of our major trading partners would rather that we stayed in the European Union. And I think there's a number of factors behind that. I mean, one is simply just that of convenience. It's easier for the Chinese or the Americans to do a deal, a trade deal, with the European Union as a united trading partner rather than as a bunch of separate individual states. So, for example, we're now trying to negotiate the TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership between the US and the EU. That would be considerably complicated if the UK suddenly decided it was going to leave the European Union. So there's that part of that is just convenience. More broadly, particularly for the US, I think there are also wider strategic and geopolitical concerns. The US is worried, I think, that if the UK left the EU, that might presage a wider breakup of the European Union, and that wouldn't really be in the best interests of the United States.
Investors are obviously watching what's happening here as well. How worried should they be, and how long should they expect this to last for, all this uncertainty?
Well, I think there is no question the uncertainty will last until we're much closer to the referendum. Because even if the polls seem to be going one way, anything could happen in the last couple of weeks, and the polls have not proved very accurate in recent British elections. So the uncertainty will certainly last until the election. Until the referendum. And I think that uncertainty will be quite significant. There will remain, until the referendum, there is likely to remain a significant probability, if not a majority probability, that we may vote to leave. So that uncertainty will remain. Post-referendum, well, either we will vote to stay in which case there will, at least in the short to medium term, be a fair degree of certainty. We'll have voted to stay in. If we vote to leave, however, then there will be a very prolonged period of uncertainty, because voting to leave in itself doesn't settle anything. There'll still be a very long period of negotiations as to what our relationship post-exit would be with the rest of the European Union. So we'd have at least 2 or 3 years of very considerable uncertainty and risk for business in that event.
Just lastly, basically, it's all going to come down to what the British people want. Do we have an idea, sentiment-wise, of whether or not they want to stay or leave the European Union?
I think for the last 20 years or so, the British attitude towards the European Union has never been particularly enthusiastic. But it's always been a minority, admittedly a very outspoken minority, who want to leave. Most of the British public has accepted that, on balance, the EU, even if we don't like some aspects of the way it has functioned, has been broadly good from the UK from an economic point of view, and leaving would cause very serious disruption. That is much more finely balanced now. I think there is still a very substantial proportion of people who feel that way, but the balance has swung, and at the moment it's quite difficult to say what the outcome will be. My prediction, for what it's worth, is that on balance the majority of the British people will still decide that, warts and all as it were, staying in the EU is preferable to leaving, and that leaving in current circumstances is just too risky. But it could be quite close, and a lot could happen in the next 4 months. So it's not a prediction I would make with any confidence.